Hi everyone. My presentation today will be very information-based, not a lot of practice, but hopefully the information will be useful to all of you. Let me see if I know how to use this. Let's go. Oh, this button. Okay, perfect. All right, so again, my name is Bethany, and I'm going to be talking about specifically research on both yoga and mindfulness in school settings. And first, a little bit about me, just to give you some context of where I'm coming from in terms of this work. So I'm an author, speaker, researcher, and yoga teacher myself. And my background is in psychology. I'm Canadian, so thank you, of course, for listening to me speak in English. I know how to say nerozumím česky. That's basically the extent of my Czech at the moment, but I'm hoping to learn more. So where I got into this work is recently I spent 2.5 years at Harvard Medical School, where I was specifically studying yoga in schools. So I got really into the research in this area during that time. I live in Prague, so I moved here in 2015. So on a personal level, I actually quit my job at Harvard so that I could come here, and there's a whole other story behind that. But personally, I became interested in this research because I experienced a lot of stress and anxiety as a university student and in my school years before university as well. And I thought that this was an interesting way to give students skills to cope with stress. And so right now I teach a positive psychology course at the University of New York in Prague as well. So what I'll be talking about today, I'll talk about what I might call the trend of yoga and mindfulness in schools. I'll go into a little bit about why it's important to do research on these topics and to know about research in this area. I'll review the research very, very briefly, because I only have 30 minutes here, but I'll do my best. I might talk about an example study if I have time. And I'll philosophize a little bit about what I think the future of yoga and mindfulness in schools might look like. And there's also some resources that I will recommend to you. So I should mention, there is a handout, a Word document that will be emailed to you. So all of the articles I talk about in this presentation, as well as a bunch of additional links and websites about research, will be provided to you on this handout, so you don't have to worry about writing everything down. There's going to be a lot of information on my slides, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but there will be a handout for you afterwards with a lot of the information. All right, so mindfulness and yoga in schools, a growing trend. So, around the world, but in the United States and Canada as well, we have a lot of articles that are coming out about yoga and mindfulness. Even Time magazine recently had an issue on the mindful revolution. And some people have called it McMindfulness, as in, mindfulness like McDonald's. It seems to be everywhere nowadays. And so it's becoming very popular and spreading into institutions. So we have mindfulness and yoga not only in schools, but in healthcare settings. We had talks this morning about organizations, mindfulness in organizations. So even at a systems level in society, mindfulness is starting to get into these larger systems that many of us work and live in on a daily basis. And some of my colleagues and I, we decided to try and study this in the United States. We tried to figure out how many school-based yoga programs there are in the United States. And so in the US, many people are coming up with their own programs and trademarking them and selling them, selling training, and same as in mindfulness with .B, learning to breathe. This is happening in the yoga in school space as well. And so we did literature reviews and some online searches to identify how many programs there are out there and where these programs are being implemented. And we ended up finding 36 different programs, and this is actually an underestimate. 36 is small. We focused on only the biggest yoga in schools programs out there, but we found 36 of them that are teaching yoga in more than 940 schools, and over 5,400 instructors have been trained in these programs. Now again, this is an underestimate. There's actually many more, I believe, but many of the people who develop these programs, they don't keep track of where their trainees go and what these people are doing and where they're teaching the programs a lot of the time. So this is probably an underestimate as well. And the programs did vary as far as how people are trained, so exactly what they're trained in, what the prerequisites are, so what the person has to have. Do they need to have a 200-hour yoga teacher training certification before they learn how to teach yoga in schools? These programs differed a lot in their training requirements. But where they were very similar was in their curriculum. So in what these 36 different programs were offering was very, very similar from program to program. So they all offer some form of physical postures, breathing exercise, relaxation techniques, and mindfulness or meditation, with additional activities that are supposed to promote student social emotional health in some way. And I'll get to this more in a moment, but basically we have a situation where there's at least 36 different programs out there that are really teaching a lot of the same things and not integrating with each other. So I'll get into this more in a moment. But as Kevin just mentioned, this is not a new idea, so it's becoming more popular, putting yoga and mindfulness into schools. But it's not new. So Swami Vivekananda, over 100 years ago, said the practice of meditation leads to mental concentration. The very essence of education is concentration of mind, not the collection of facts. If I had to do my education once again, I would not study facts at all. I would develop the power of concentration and detachment. So again, this is not necessarily a new thing that we're talking about here. Same with William James, who is considered by many to be the founding father of psychology. In 1890, he said, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is master of himself if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. So the idea that he's describing mindfulness in a way, the ability to bring a wandering mind back again and again, in William James's mind would be an excellent education. So this is not new, but it is gaining popularity, which is very interesting and what we'll talk about today. So, why should we do research on yoga and mindfulness in schools, especially if we already know that it works? So those of you who work in school settings, maybe you've tried to teach a bit of mindfulness, or if you have children yourselves, and you've probably seen some good results. So why do we need to do formal research studies if we already know that this works? Well, there's a few different reasons. One is that we have to be careful that we aren't overconfident. So do we really know what the effects of these interventions are? Are the results always positive? So there are some studies that have shown what we might call counterintuitive effects, where sometimes students show increases in things like stress after a mindfulness intervention. Now some hypothesize that this is because the children actually become more mindful of how stressed they are. This is why then when they do questionnaires, their stress goes up after they learn mindfulness, which is a possibility. But you know, we really have to keep in mind that children are what you might consider a vulnerable population. They are easily influenced by their teachers, by their parents, and so we just have to be very mindful ourselves of what we're teaching them and what we are giving them. And it's important to know the research behind something before you implement it. So for example, if you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you some kind of medication, you usually at least hope that this doctor has some knowledge of why that medication might work for you, or they might not be an expert in all the research studies that have ever been done on that medication, but they probably have at least some idea of what the mechanism behind what that pill is going to do to you. So in the same way, if we are offering something to our youth, to our children, we need to know, you know, what is this actually doing? What is the mechanism behind why this works? So that we can be ethical in providing these types of things to youth. Also, just from a funding perspective, government agencies like numbers. So if we have hard numbers, you know, they like data. So if we can show that these practices actually have a beneficial effect, these programs might be more likely to get funded at a national level, which then might lead to systems change. So once you can start to get things funded at a higher level, systems like actual entire school systems can start to change. This isn't an easy process, but I think that it's something that's necessary if we really want mindfulness and, for example, yoga to be in our education system, healthcare system. We need to have data to back it up. So what I'm going to do when I describe research in this presentation is focus on, instead of focusing on a number of small studies, I'm going to focus on larger meta-analyses and literature reviews that have analyzed many different studies together to kind of give you an overall picture of the state of the research in this area. If you're interested in individual studies, I provide on the handout that you'll get, I provide the references to the studies, so you can look up individual studies if you want. You can also email me if you want, and I have PDFs of all of the studies that I talk about in this presentation, so I'll be providing my email at the end as well. So a very, very brief review of the research on mindfulness and yoga in schools. First, I want to present this model. I published this this year in 2016 with a few of my colleagues from Harvard Medical School, and we were trying to come up with, like I said a moment ago, the mechanism behind why is it that yoga and mindfulness have positive effects? What is it that these things are doing inside children's minds? And so this model, we developed it for yoga, but I think it can easily apply a lot of it to mindfulness as well. So we're suggesting up at the, which one is it this? Oh yeah. So up at the top here, the yoga practices. So yoga practices usually involve postures, breathing, some form of relaxation, and some form of mindfulness or meditation in some capacity. And what we propose in this model is that doing yoga leads to these three core competencies. So it ends up helping children develop these three core things. One of them being mind-body awareness, which has a number of different aspects like mindfulness and social awareness. Also self-regulation, so emotion regulation, stress regulation. And then also, which is a little bit different, you know, this might happen with mindfulness, but you know, could definitely happen with yoga, is the physical fitness aspects of flexibility, strength, balance. I think that this can also happen with mindfulness as well, because as we become more mindful of what our bodies feel like when we eat a huge bag of potato chips, or you know, we start to realize that maybe we don't feel so great when we do that. So I think that mindfulness, even perhaps without the physical activities, can promote, for example, less childhood obesity and that kind of thing. So, which is a big thing in the United States right now. And so the idea is that these three core competencies then lead to these positive outcomes down here, which is improved behaviors, mental state, health, and performance. So reductions in psychological disorders, improvements in mood, etc. Now this is just a preliminary model. It really needs to be tested. We do cite research in this paper that supports this model, but there's still a lot that remains to be done in this field, which is, again, what I'll get to in a moment too. But this is at least an initial start, an idea or a hypothesis as to how mindfulness and yoga might work in schools. So I'll start here with a systematic review of mindfulness-based interventions for youth in school settings. This was an article that was just published in 2015, so it's relatively recent. And they found 28 peer-reviewed quantitative studies of mindfulness-based interventions in school settings. So they took 28 individual studies and summarized them, summarized the results. So many of the studies reported decreases in negative outcomes, things like anxiety and depression. And the studies also often reported improvements in beneficial outcomes like emotion regulation and social skills. The authors suggest that there's more research that's needed using randomized control designs. This is a really big limitation. There needs to be more randomized control trials, especially governments. They want these randomized control trials, so these are important. Also, they encouraged authors to use more diverse outcome measures other than self-report questionnaires. So self-report questionnaires are quick, they're easy, they're cheap, but too many people are using them. So they're suggesting that perhaps trying to get physiological outcomes like heart rate or even body weight, like I said in the US with childhood obesity being a big problem. And also including data from school records like grades. So data that schools already collect regularly, number of detentions, number of suspensions, these kinds of things can be really impactful because this is the kind of data that really matters to schools and to education at national levels. Now there's another there's a meta-analysis on mindfulness in schools that was published in 2014. So meta-analysis is when they take a large number of studies in an area and they actually do statistical analyses to see how the results of all of the studies pool together. So this study looked at 24 different individual quantitative studies of school-based mindfulness, focusing on psychological outcomes. And they did find statistically significant effect sizes. These effect sizes indicated a small to medium effect of school-based mindfulness on psychological outcomes. So it's not like the effect was huge, but it was there. It was an effect size of 0.40. And they actually broke it down. So they looked at the effect sizes for different types of outcomes. And they found that the effect sizes were strongest for student outcomes related to cognitive performance, things like attention, reaction time, cognitive skills like that. The effects were smaller, but still significant for resilience and stress. So these are things usually measured by self-report questionnaires. Now, interestingly, the effects were small and not significant, so not statistically significant for measures of emotional problems and for parent or teacher ratings, which is very interesting because a lot of studies that try to study mindfulness in schools use measures of emotional problems. And I've been to many conferences in the United States on mindfulness and yoga in schools. And at conferences, you get to talk to other researchers who, you get to learn about what studies they aren't publishing. So the studies that go into the drawer in their office. And there are many studies of mindfulness in schools out there that have not been published because the researchers did not find significant effects. And often it's because they're measuring emotional problems. And I'm not sure exactly why it's the case that sometimes these measures don't work for children. Sometimes I think there's developmental appropriateness issues in terms of using self-report questionnaires of stress or emotional problems with young children. But anyway, this research area is very new and there's a lot that remains to be done. So these authors also suggested that more randomized controlled trials are needed. Authors need to start collecting follow-up data and collecting data other than self-report, because it seems like these self-report questionnaires, they are hit or miss. So sometimes you find results and sometimes you don't. And even using the same scale, sometimes a questionnaire works in one school and then doesn't seem to work in another. So there's a lot that remains to be done here in terms of how to measure outcomes of these types of studies. And then a study that I co-authored with my supervisor from Harvard, meta-analysis, but we did a systematic literature review of yoga in schools. And so we went through many different databases and we found as many studies of yoga in schools as we could possibly find. And these were peer-reviewed studies, so all studies published in academic journals. And we found 47, so there seems to be, at least at this time, which was this year that it was published in 2016, around 47 studies of yoga in schools. Now, the majority of the studies were published from 2010 onwards. So 87% of the studies were published in the last 6 years. So that just shows how new this research area is. Most of the studies also had very significant design limitations, which is very similar to the research on mindfulness in schools. So they didn't, there weren't often randomized control trials, although they do exist and they are getting more and more popular. But a lot of the studies were pilot studies with small sample sizes and relatively weak research designs. But the results, again, are promising. So there were promising effects of yoga for child and adolescent mental, physical, and social emotional health. So generally, again, we didn't do a meta-analysis, so we don't have effect size estimates, but just generally, the studies that have been published, remember I said there's a lot that are not getting published, but the published studies do seem to show promising results. So what is the take-home message from all of this research? So again, I've gone over some studies that have summarized a lot of smaller individual studies. So the take-home message is that there's a relatively small number of studies out there, but these studies suggest that mindfulness and yoga might be beneficial in school settings. When I say relatively small, I'm saying this because if you think of a research area like cancer or Alzheimer's, the number of research studies on these topics number in the thousands. Here we have 47 studies of yoga in schools and maybe 28. Now there's probably around 30 to 40 studies of mindfulness in schools. So compared to a topic like cancer or Alzheimer's, this is still a very new research field. So the research is very preliminary and much remains to be done. And so what I like to say, my sort of favorite sentence, is that research on mindfulness and yoga in schools is preliminary but promising. So it's in its initial stages. There's still things that need to be done, but the initial results are promising and do suggest that we should do more research. But the results do seem to be showing positive findings, at least most of the results. How much time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay.
Let's time for discussion.
Okay. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. I wanted just to give you all an example of a study, a specific study. So this is a study that I ran when I was living in Boston, and this was a randomized controlled trial of yoga in a school setting. So we had government funding in the US to do this. So it was an urban school in Boston, and it was a study that was funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the US. And we wanted to see whether yoga would reduce substance use risk factors in 7th graders. So substance use is like alcohol and drug use. We wanted to see whether yoga would have a beneficial effect on this. So we had 211 students, and they were randomly assigned, just completely by chance, to receive either yoga during their physical education class or just physical education as usual. So physical education was our control group, in a way, in this study. And we used the Kripalu Yoga in the Schools intervention. So Kripalu is a yoga retreat center in the US, and they've developed their own yoga in schools intervention. So the students who were in the yoga group, they received yoga for around 6 months. So yoga completely replaced their physical education classes for around 6 months. So almost the entire school year. So the intervention took place from October until April, and the students got around 2 classes per week of yoga, about 35-minute classes, so around an hour of yoga per week. The students who were in the yoga group, the physical education students, just continued to receive physical education as usual. And one of the interesting results that we found is that if you look at baseline, the yoga and control group were similar in terms of their willingness to smoke cigarettes. So we gave them a questionnaire that just asked them, how willing would you be to take 1 puff of a cigarette? Or if your friends had some cigarettes at a party, how willing would you be to try some? What we found is that after the yoga intervention, the students in the control group, so that's the white line there, they became more willing to smoke cigarettes than students in the yoga group, which is the black line here. So this is suggesting that perhaps yoga prevented students from becoming more willing to smoke cigarettes. And this type of result has been found in other studies of yoga interventions as well, that sometimes it's not necessarily that the yoga makes things better, it's that it prevents things from getting worse. So it's not necessarily that the students, they're suddenly these perfect little students. It's just that they don't deteriorate sometimes. And this is what we found here, that the control group became more willing to smoke cigarettes, whereas the yoga group stayed the same. They increased a little bit here, but this is not statistically significantly different. So that was one result. The next result is a little bit complex, but I'll try to explain it kind of quickly. What we basically found is that, so we collected data at baseline, then after the yoga intervention, but then we also collected data 6 months later at time 3 and 1 year later after we had implemented the intervention. So the intervention stopped, but we kept collecting data to see what the effects might be over time. And what we found, this solid line here is girls. And we found that girls in the yoga group, from before to after the intervention, it looked like their emotional self-control, so this is like self-regulation, it looked like their emotional self-control didn't change from before to after the intervention. But then you see at time 4, this is 1 year after the intervention ended, so they're not even getting yoga anymore. They're not doing yoga. But this is when they show an increase in their emotional self-control. Alternatively, or in contrast, when you look at the control group, you see this effect for boys. This actually isn't statistically significant, but basically with boys, you see this, they're the dotted line. And 1 year after the intervention, boys in the control group show this increase in emotional self-control. So the control group, remember, was physical education, as usual. So we seem to have this gender kind of crossover effect where boys who get gym show an increase in their emotional self-control 1 year later, and girls who get yoga show an increase in their emotional self-control 1 year later. So again, They weren't even getting yoga anymore. So it's, but this effect has actually now been found in other studies as well. It's what we might call a sleeper effect. So there isn't an effect right away, but there seems to be an effect a little bit later. So it's interesting to think that perhaps for youth, it might be that these skills take a little bit of time to integrate and to be applied in their lives, and maybe don't show up until a little bit later. But this study was, again, it was a randomized control trial, but it was preliminary, and this effect would definitely need to be replicated in order for us to say it's really a fact. But it's interesting, at least, to think about, and it'll be interesting to see if this gets replicated in other studies. And we also had quotes. I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just read maybe this one down here. We did interviews with the students, and so we got to get some quotes from them about what they thought of the yoga. And so this quote down here, the student says, "I didn't notice it at first, but I noticed since I started yoga. In term 1, my science grade was a C, but last term I got a B, and this term I'm pretty sure I have an A average right now. And I sort of feel like that's because of yoga, because I have science immediately after yoga." So these students were quite aware of the potential effects of the yoga, and we're about to publish a qualitative study as well, where we present the results of the one-on-one interviews that we did with the students. All right, so let me speculate about the future. I think I have maybe 5 minutes.
No, in fact 10 minutes, sorry, my mistake.
Oh, I have 10 minutes now. I can be so leisurely. All right, I can really philosophize here. So what I think about the future of mindfulness and yoga in schools, and this is specifically from a research perspective that I'm talking about here. So in terms of the future, like I said, this research is preliminary. It's a small number of studies. There's more that definitely needs to be done in this field. And a few interesting questions that I have about this are, what is the appropriate mindfulness or yoga dose for young people? How much is enough? How much is too much? In the school where I did this study in Boston, they had 32 yoga classes. It took almost 6 months. There were many students, especially young athletic males, who didn't want they didn't like that the yoga took over their gym class for so long. So what is the appropriate dose? And does that change? Maybe for 7-year-old kids, maybe it's different than 10-year-olds or 14-year-olds. We're not sure. Not enough research has been done on this to know for sure. Do some age groups, genders, or cultures show more positive or negative effects than others? So do different groups show different results? You saw in my research that boys and girls perhaps show different effects. Could there be cultural changes? So I'd be interested to know in the Czech Republic, are Czech children somehow different? Might they respond differently to mindfulness interventions? And I am becoming involved in some research here on mindfulness in schools, so I'm going to be very interested to find out what lies ahead in this country as well. What are the long-term effects of these interventions? Do the effects last? Do they wear off? In my study, we seem to find these sleeper or delayed effects where effects didn't show up at all at first, and then suddenly 1 year later, the students are showing beneficial effects. And why would that happen? So these are all very important questions that need to be answered. What types of outcomes show the greatest effect? So is it that mindfulness and yoga have a lot of effect on stress, but not as much on attention, or is it the opposite of that? We still don't really know exactly what outcomes are being affected and in what ways. And what I think is very important is that we resist the urge to view yoga and mindfulness as a panacea, so like as a magic cure that is just going to make everything better in the world and in society and for our children. I think that definitely mindfulness and yoga have a lot to offer, but they might not necessarily cure everything that our children are going through. And to be honest, when I was doing research in Boston, I started to feel kind of like a yoga pusher. Like, when someone sells drugs and they're trying to push drugs on you, I started to feel like I was kind of trying to push yoga into schools, and I was like a zealot, like a religious zealot who's trying to push their philosophy on people. So I think that it's important to make sure that we are also mindful about how we present mindfulness to school settings and in education. There are also very many, perhaps too many, school-based mindfulness and yoga programs being developed. So we have .B, Mind Up, Learning to Breathe, Yoga for Classrooms. There's so many of these programs, which in a way is a bit of a lack of integration, and it ends up breeding competition instead of collaboration. So especially in the US, You know, people develop their programs, and then they want research done on their program to prove that their program is the best, so that more people will buy their program. Now, this isn't necessarily the people who develop these programs, most of the time they have very good intentions, and they just want to get mindfulness and yoga out there to our youth. But they end up kind of subconsciously competing with each other for funds, for grant money, for resources, all of that. So I think that we could integrate a little bit more, because a lot of these programs are teaching very similar things, and then they start reinventing the wheel. And they don't need to if they worked closer together. Also, Kevin brought this up as well. How might we integrate mindfulness, yoga, and social emotional learning? Are mindfulness and yoga actually social emotional learning programs, or are they something kind of different? Can we somehow bring these three things together within education? I talk about this a little bit in one of my articles, but it's a really important point, because especially in the US, social emotional learning is big news. It's big right now. And if yoga and mindfulness can find ways to integrate with that, I think they'll be much more accepted within schools. And I think we need to focus at a systems level instead of using mindfulness and yoga as band-aids to cover systemic problems in schools. So again, a lot of the time when I was trying to advocate mindfulness or yoga in schools, it was sort of this approach of mindfulness and yoga will help your children to sit down, shut up, and pay attention for 8 hours. And it's like Ritalin. It's not a pill, but people are kind of marketing it in that way. And of course, it's kind of to get your foot in the door in a school, to talk like this. But I think we really need to pay attention to what's going on with education in general, and a lot of what Kevin talked about, that the education system, it's not functioning properly anymore. And so I think it's very important for us to focus on that too. So the future. This is a picture of some students in the US in the 1920s, brushing their teeth. And so what happened was a lot of students were missing school because of tooth problems, because students weren't taught about dental hygiene and mouth hygiene. So dentists started going into schools and teaching students about the importance of brushing their teeth. I'm not sure if this happens in the Czech Republic as well, but even when I was young, we have a dentist who comes in and they teach you about plaque and all the problems with your teeth. And so the idea is perhaps that in the same way, so it's not like brushing your teeth fixes your entire life, but it does help you keep from missing school because you aren't in pain from tooth problems. Perhaps in the same way that we use dental hygiene, we can use mental hygiene in our schools. So people can come in, or teachers themselves can become mindful and teach mindfulness, which then becomes a form of mental hygiene that you do every day to keep your mind healthy, in the same way that brushing your teeth keeps your teeth healthy. So very quickly, in terms of resources, like I said, there'll be a handout provided to you. Especially on that handout, there is this research repository that I helped develop. It's a 46-page list of every single peer-reviewed academic article on yoga and mindfulness in schools. And it has links to abstracts of the studies or full text where it's available. It's free. It's a free PDF that you can download. Again, this link will be on the handout, so I definitely recommend that. You can also connect with me, so I have a website, I'm on Facebook. If you try to find me on Facebook, find the me that has the Ph.D. after my name, because that's my professional profile. My personal profile, I'm sorry, I probably won't accept you to be a friend because we don't know each other. But I do have a professional profile that you're more than, you can follow if you want, and I'm on Twitter as well. And so my hope is that there's this little cartoon, this is the evolution of Americans, but I think it really applies to many, many cultures out there. And my hope is that we can move from this sort of an evolution, which is what we tend to be going through right now, perhaps to something that looks a little bit more like this. So thank you. And I think we have time for questions.
Yes,
yeah?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in the differences between meditation, mindfulness practices, meditation, and yoga. Is it what the?
I can repeat too. Differences between.
What difference does it make for me if I meditate 20 minutes a day, if I do 20 minutes of yoga a day, or for the children in school? Are there any data?
There actually, as far as I know, I don't think there has been a study yet of yoga and directly comparing yoga in schools to mindfulness in schools. My supervisor, who I worked with in Boston, was very pro-yoga, and he really liked to say that yoga was better than mindfulness, and he liked to pit them against each other. I think that the physical aspects involved in yoga are perhaps important, especially for young children, to get the body moving a little bit before sitting still. Now I know that like mindfulness-based stress reduction does have mindful movement, so it's there is that aspect of movement even involved in mindfulness as well. So I think the main difference is that yoga involves physical movement of some sort. Perhaps that physical movement is emphasized a bit more in yoga than in mindfulness. But as far as I know, at least in children, there aren't studies comparing the two. I'd be interested to know the results as well. I think that perhaps the results might be similar, although I would maybe argue that I think the movement part is important for young people. They sit all day, at their desks, and so there are school-based yoga programs where you stretch at your desk, so you just kind of use your chair and do chair-related things, and I think that can be really useful for kids. So, but I don't. The research still hasn't been done yet on that.
Thank you.
So with all the respect to everything, but yoga is a spiritual path, which was not mentioned here. So you have to teach it. So again, so yoga is a spiritual path, which was not mentioned. So you have to teach the kids about yin, yang, death, and life, Shiva, Shakti, and all of, and Hinduism as well. So
that's a good point. There's a very big debate about this in the U.S. right now for both mindfulness and yoga, actually, as both having a spiritual lineage. That if you divorce the practices from their spiritual lineage, then perhaps you aren't actually teaching the real. In the U.S. especially, there's this separation of church and state, and there are some schools, there's one most recently in California that was sued for teaching mindfulness and yoga in their school. And the school did win and were able to prove that they weren't teaching anything religious to the children. But some argue that even with meditating or yoga, that the postures themselves contain spiritual energy, and that even if you aren't directly teaching something spiritual verbally, that something spiritual is happening. And it does make some parents nervous, and it can cause a lot of problems. So the answer right now, at least what people are trying to do, is to keep their programs as non-religious as possible. So say with yoga, they will call the poses like owl pose, or they come up with different animal names for the children. They don't do namaste, they don't put hands at the chest, they don't even ring bells, like Tibetan bells a lot of the time, just to keep it secular, like not as non-religious as possible. And again, this study hasn't been done, but is it really the same thing if you teach it without the spirituality? And the jury is still out on that. It's still a very big debate. At this court case in California, there was a Harvard professor who was very adamant and who has done research that these programs are spiritual, even if you don't teach them in a spiritual way. And so this particular case, the parents are appealing, and it might make its way all the way to the Supreme Court in the U.S. So we still have to wait and see what happens with that. But it's a great point, and there's still a lot that needs to be contemplated about that.
And another question, if it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what here in Europe, in your opinion, what age, when are the kids ready to start to learn yoga? Because, for example, in India, they do not teach kids yoga because it's a spiritual path. It's a way. So, for example, the kids till they are 10, they do not understand death, the word, the meaning of death. Já už se nebudu na nic ptát. I'm not going to ask anything.
Well, and I get where you're going with this, because as far as age, a lot of these programs, again, they don't teach the spiritual part, so they don't mention death at all. So it's really, there's, at least in the US, there's programs for preschool yoga, and they just sort of do a bunch of like, here we'll do this funny pose, and if you see pictures, it just looks kind of cute. Is that yoga or not? From a spiritual perspective, perhaps not, but I think in Europe, again, I don't know, I've only lived here for 1 year, so I don't have a lot of experience with European children in schools in general. But I think that the basics of the postures, and even basics of mindfulness as well, can be taught at these younger ages without the spiritual component. And research does seem promising that there are some beneficial effects, even without teaching the spiritual part. So, you know, there's more that remains to be done, but I think that, you know, we're moving forward to some extent. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, again, hopefully they will provide the handout to you. If they don't for some reason, just email me. Like I said, I have PDFs of all of the studies that I talked about in the presentation today. So definitely get in touch if you're interested in learning more. And thank you for your attention.